Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Weiner, Program Manager of Education and Practice at the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health. Thank you for joining us for today's ASPPH Presents webinar, originally intended for presentation at the 2017 Undergraduate Summit. Liberal education, professional education, is it time for an intentional, integrative approach? Today's webinar will be 1 hour in length. We will begin with a short introduction of our presenters, followed by the presentation and allowing for time at the end for questions. This webinar is part of the 2017 ASPPH Presents monthly series. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the ASPPH website in the archived webinar section soon. Additionally, this webinar has been approved for 1 hour of CPH continuing education credit. While you are in listen-only mode and your lines have been muted, we encourage you to ask questions and post discussion points throughout the presentation by using the question box. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. We are pleased to have with us today our speakers, Dr. Sarah McKenzie, Mark Kiviniemi, and Robert Pack. Dr. Sarah McKenzie is a senior lecturer at the University of Washington School of Public Health. Her pathway to undergraduate public health education was preceded by 15 years of practice as a family medicine and adolescent medicine boarded physician. She returned to school to obtain an MPH in 2003, began teaching a personal and public health course for freshmen at the UW, and co-authored a personal health college textbook which integrates public health. As Assistant Dean for Undergraduate Education, she led the development of the UW School of Public Health Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Science Public Health majors, following a liberal education model, and continues to direct the 500 student program. She teaches multiple undergraduate courses and is involved in curriculum design, evidence-based teaching, faculty, and program development. Dr. Mark Kiviniemi is Associate Professor of Community Health and Health Behavior and Director of Undergraduate Public Health Programs in the School of Public Health and Health Professions at the University at Buffalo, SUNY, or UB. In Dr. Kiviniemi's administrative role, for the last 2 years, he has facilitated UB's process of developing an undergraduate curriculum for the public health major and minor, grappling with many of the questions addressed in this session. Prior to joining UB, he was Assistant Professor of Psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He has taught general education courses for a university-wide audience, undergraduate and graduate courses designed for both major and non-majors, as well as public health coursework specifically designed for students from other health professions. And our third speaker, Dr. Robert Pack, is Professor of Community and Behavioral Health, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the College of Public Health at East Tennessee State University, and Director of the ETSU Center for Prescription Drug Abuse Prevention and Treatment. He has been engaged in public health curriculum, program, and school development since the beginning of his career. He spent his first 9 years as a faculty member at the West Virginia University School of Medicine, Department of Community Medicine, now the WVU School of Public Health, and has spent the past 9 years at the East Tennessee State University College of Public Health, which has several large undergraduate programs. He has been the lead co-chair of the Academic Affairs section of the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health for 2 of the past 3 years. Thank you all for being here today, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to Sarah.
Good morning. Thank you all for taking the time and joining us. We seem to have a knack for timing our talks with major weather or geological events following the eclipse yesterday and being canceled in the spring due to the snowstorm in DC. Let's see if I can get this to move. All right, so our learning objectives for today are to identify critical components of liberal education approach to public health majors and to identify critical components of professional education approaches to public health majors, and then really to create an opportunity to explore integration of these approaches and raise the question of, is this dichotomy a real dichotomy? Okay, there we go. So a subtitle for this talk is really, who are we training our students to be and how are we doing it? This slide is a Moodle Word image that I created looking at our graduates and what they are currently doing. And I include this to highlight the tremendous range of post-graduation pathways that our students take. everything from family resource coordinator, going on to grad school, CDC public health associates, to health professional trainings, to resident counselors, nurse technicians, a tremendous range of career paths. When the three of us were preparing for the spring session, we recognized when we talked about where our students were going, and you'll hear this, I believe, through each of our talks, that there are ranges regardless of the type of programs that we are envisioning. It's also important to think about the context in which we are considering public health training. We are in a very rapidly changing context and environment. We have lots of resources and materials available. We also have calls to think differently about how we are doing public health work in communities and around the world. For any of you who might be new and starting to think about planning of a program, or maybe have just recently become involved with undergrad education, there are tremendous array of resources from the Framing the Future ASPPH work that really highlights approaches to undergraduate public health education in their undergrad report. The CEIF competencies that were developed in 2016 used a lot of this work to help guide the competency development. The AACU has materials around liberal education and the LEAP criteria. There's thinking about Public Health 3.0, a call to action to create a 21st century public health infrastructure, really starting to look at the context of how public health work is being done, recognizing that we are in a context where governmental public health funding is being cut, and there are definitely calls for more integration and working in interdisciplinary manners within communities to collaboratively solve the problems and create solutions for health in communities. There's the Health in All Policies approach, which really calls and highlights the fact that health and public health are really part of all aspects of career planning, and health needs to be integrated throughout all work that is done, especially at the policy level. There's series of IOM reports, Institute of Medicine reports, looking at how we plan for healthy futures, and the Educated Citizen Act, or calls. And so there are a lot of resources that are really setting the context and really asking us to question what is the work of public health professionals at this time, and how are we going to innovatively solve problems moving forward. We also have that in the context that we have a rapidly, exponentially increasing number of undergraduates who are being trained in public health. And so it's an opportunity for many of us who have perhaps been in undergraduate education for our careers to think about how public health gets integrated into that. Or for those of us coming from more professional approaches, how does this expansion into the undergraduate arena ask us to think about how we teach and what we do? The exponential growth signifies that we've got to be intentional with what we're doing with the educational pathways and how we're working with students. We want to pause just for a moment, if you have a pencil or a pen handy and a piece of paper, to just pause and reflect. Where do you see your program? Before we go into more formal descriptions of what we mean by liberal education and professional education, if this is a continuum, where would you mark your program, or how you think about undergraduate public health education? Are you closer to the liberal education end, or closer to the professional education? Much of this may be framed by your own personal educational pathway, or framed by the context in which you are working, the institution that you're within, or perhaps framed by some of these other resources that we've identified. But make a commitment on a line of where you see yourself at present. We do want to highlight that this is not just a philosophical academic discussion. How we design curricula has significant impact and how we frame it on the curriculum itself. It has impact on how we define and prepare the workforce. So who we think we are training students to be will influence how we train them to be that. Who we ask to contribute and give feedback to our curriculum will influence how we establish and develop our curriculum. How we frame this educational approach with this exponentially growing number of undergrads will have an impact on educated citizen goals, on public health 3.0, on health and all policy goals. It will have an impact on how we develop and strengthen our faculty and our staff workforce. How do we educate our faculty who may be working with undergraduates for the first time? How do we help them work with students? And how do we work with our staff who advise and teach students about career pathways? If we can be more intentional about what we are doing, it will help in all of these areas so that students, staff, faculty, and the workforce have clear expectations and that we're aligning and meeting those expectations. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who will go in depth into liberal education framing. Take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks, everybody, for joining us, especially anyone who is going to be at the summit in March and has stuck with us until this presentation in August. We appreciate it. So my task today is to give you a sense of what a liberal education framework for undergraduate public health looks like. If you do some reading on liberal education, you don't have to go far to find a lot of very nice, very inspirational definitions of what the liberal education approach is like. We talk about things like critical thinking, liberating students, bettering society, a lot of very good, high-minded, lofty rhetoric that's very inspirational. I'm going to completely ignore those definitions for today and take a very bottom-up approach to thinking about what a liberal education framework means. When we sit down to design our curricula in public health, the real question to ask is the chopping block question, right? What stays in our curriculum and what goes? In our major in public health at the University at Buffalo, our students take 42 credit hours of public health coursework. They take another 18 hours in other domains. So they have 60 credit hours, which even if you take the full-fledged Carnegie definition, gets 180 hours that we have to teach them what we think they need to know about public health. And there's no way to cover everything that you possibly could in that number of credit hours. So you have to make decisions about what's essential for the curriculum and what gets left out. And at the same time, we're facing the context that Sarah set up in her introduction. We're preparing students for a very different public health world than was true even 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. And we're preparing them for a diverse range of job options. And both of those things inform that question of what stays and what goes. So what I'd like to do is to give you a sense of how you answer those questions and decide what's essential for a curriculum within a liberal education framing. And to do that, we're going to take a backward design approach. So backward design has been talked about by a number of people. Wiggins and McTire, probably the two most known with it. The idea from backwards design, whether you're designing a class session or an undergraduate curriculum in public health, is that you begin by asking, what's the purpose of the educational experience? What outcomes do you want students to have when they finish your program that they didn't have at the beginning? And then once you've defined those desired outcomes, you go down a level to say, if we're going to achieve those outcomes, what do students have to be able to do? What are the skill sets that they need to demonstrate, the knowledge that they need to have mastery of in order to achieve those purposes? And then and only then do you decide what to cover in a particular curriculum. So from the liberal education perspective, there are particular answers to each of those questions. So when I look at the liberal education framing and the kind of thinking that I've done in our group here at the University of Buffalo has done in designing our major, we see a threefold purpose to the educational experience. The first purpose from a liberal ed perspective is to prepare students for careers. It is absolutely positively the case, and any of you talking to parents can sell this and should sell this, that a liberal education framing is designed to prepare students for the careers that they'll occupy after they finish our program. It's a tremendously important goal of the educational experience. It's also, though, important to notice what I did and didn't say in that statement. So I very purposefully used the word career rather than job. So we're preparing students to go into a public health workforce and have careers that will last for 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years, not just the jobs that they'll fulfill in the first 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 years afterwards. So thinking in that long-term career perspective is central to the liberal education approach. No less an authority on liberal education than the president of Harvard has said in various places that the purpose of a liberal education is to prepare students for their 6th job, not just their first job. So taking that career-wide focus. And you'll also see that I didn't say the word public health anywhere in that statement about careers. If you go back and you look at Sarah's word cloud, graduates from our programs are going to a range of job opportunities, some of which have public health in the job title, many of which who don't. So business analyst, public school teacher, AmeriCorps volunteer, all of these things were part of the word salad that Sarah had, in addition to the incredible range of careers that do have public health in the job title. So we have as an outcome focus preparing students for a wide range of career options. The second characteristic for outcomes for a liberal education approach is that we focus on giving students a toolbox that they can use following their educational experience, more so than on specific concrete content. So we have outcomes like developing the kinds of cognitive skills that students will need after graduation. So how do we teach students to gather data, to analyze problems, to use that analysis to draw conclusions, and use those conclusions to figure out ways to improve the situation that they started with analyzing? How do we provide them with the kinds of ethical tools to do ethical reasoning in public health and other contexts? How do we provide them with the social and emotional tools to take on leadership roles and group work roles? And so we think about the outcomes of education more as a set of both intellectual and other skills that we can give students that give them a toolbox to interact with their careers and with the world around them. And then the third characteristic for outcomes of education is that liberal education has a focus on creating educated citizens. Beyond the specific content on public health and career focus, one of the ideals of liberal education is that we make the world a better place by preparing students who can go out into the world and in their roles as members of society, use the knowledge that they've gained in our program in effective ways. And we'll say more about that a bit later. So those are the outcome goals that we strive to achieve in the liberal education approach. And then the question becomes, what do students have to learn how and what to do while they're in our program? And so feeding down from the purposes of education, the skill set goal then becomes to identify those skills that are common across the 3 outcomes. So given the limited number of credit hours and the number of things that a student actually can master over the course of an undergraduate program, how do we pick those things that are applicable across a range of careers that do give that kind of tool set that we want and contribute not only to public health, but to the broader goal of being an educated citizen? So answering that question for an entire major takes way more time than I have today. So for this purpose, I want to give you just one example from our curriculum here at the University of Buffalo. One of the courses in our core curriculum for the major is called Models and Mechanisms for Understanding Public Health. It's designed to give students a set of tools that they can use to analyze and understand a range of public health problems, anything from infectious disease to chronic disease to environmental issues, and to have a language for explaining problems and a set of tools for analyzing and understanding causes and effects. About a third of the learning objectives in that course center around thinking about complex systems. How do you understand effects that have multiple causes? When there are multiple causes, how do you think about and explain the relation between them? And what does that mean for when something does or doesn't happen? And that's applicable to understanding why some people get sick and other people don't. It's applicable to understanding how a community system works. It works in a range of areas. Now, the nice thing about those kinds of demonstration of skills, so being able to analyze and understand and explain a problem using complex modeling approaches, is that it meets all of these goals for a liberal ed framework. From the perspective of careers, arguably every public health problem our students are going to address in their careers has complex causes. And once you have that skill set for understanding causes, you can do a range of things with them. It prepares a student to go into a situation as an epidemiologist and understand an infectious disease outbreak using the epidemiologic triad. But the same kind of logic of understanding multiple causes and effects is true for a student who's working in an environmental health setting and understanding the complexities of how a particular toxin encounters a human and makes them sick. And it's applicable for a student working in a community education setting and understanding the complex set of causes that are influencing people's behaviors in a social ecological framework. So it's a tool that once you have is broadly applicable in public health and other settings. It's also a set of skills that involve developing intellectual tools. So from a Bloom's taxonomy perspective, you cannot adequately demonstrate your ability to analyze a complex system and understand causes and relations between them without doing things like application and analysis and synthesis and the kind of higher order cognitive skills that we want our students to develop as a part of their undergrad education. And then last but not least, regardless of where you fall on the political domain with respect to the healthcare debate, I think one of the things that we've all learned over the past 9 months is that understanding and dealing with healthcare financing requires understanding complex systems and how changing one part of a system has intractable effects on other parts of the system. So you see there how, starting from a liberal education approach and having that triune set of outcomes for a career then feeds down into the kinds of skill sets that you choose to focus on in particular courses and throughout your programs. And then the last piece becomes the question of what you cover, right, in your courses, given the limited number of credit hours, but also the wide range of possible outcomes that accrue. And in the liberal education perspective, I would argue that you think about the kinds of content and the kinds of specific knowledge that best enable you to achieve the higher level toolbox and skill goals that get to the outcomes. The specifics of what content you cover become in service to the higher order critical thinking and ethical reasoning and other kinds of toolbox goals that you have. And as you saw in the example a moment ago, you can do the same kind of analysis of cause and effects with multiple different specific content from a range of different public health areas. And so the content question becomes answered in service of the kinds of skill sets you want your students to achieve. This potentially becomes a very useful perspective when you have the debates in curriculum development meetings of what we have to cover. Because if you ask a group of faculty to list the things that they have to cover, you will get enough of a list to cover 2.5 undergraduate degrees. And so you have to winnow down. You have to go back to that chopping block approach. But starting with that definitional set of outcomes and thinking about the kinds of skills that you want students to develop then eases some of the burden of exactly what gets covered. If you teach the higher order analysis and thinking skills, then those can be applied to a range of very specific content. So I very purposefully focused this overview on concrete implementational details, but I do want to end with a little bit of inspiration, which is to say that all of us went into public health because we believe that public health makes the world a better place. We think that ensuring the conditions where everyone can be healthy, having environments that promote health rather than promote illness, developing the kinds of systems that ensure that everybody can have optimal health and well-being fundamentally makes the world better. And in the same sense, I think the goal of our education and the goal of both of the approaches that we're talking about today are based on the idea that training students in public health, whether they go on to careers in public health or not, makes the world better. Having students working in public health, but also a range of people who can think about and appreciate a public health perspective ultimately benefits all of us and is the ultimate goal of the educational experience under any of these frameworks. So with that, I will turn it over to Rob to share the professional education perspective.
Thank you, Mark. Touch my screen here, make sure I have control. There we go. All right, thank you so much. What is striking about your presentation, I think, is that just the similarity in many of the concepts that I'm going to bring forward here. Our undergrad in public health, the Bachelor of Science in Public Health, basically we've been doing it for about 60 years from the time when we first started offering a minor in public health to then the major. And we have a lot of grads that are out in the community already working in the workforce, and they're basically professionals in the workforce that have been informing our revision process over time. And so that back and forth with those professionals has been really the anchoring point for our curriculum and manners in which we've made modifications. The last revision for our BSPH actually took us, we believe, in a place a little further down what we believe is the continuum toward professional education, with more focus on field and so on. So listen for some of those things while I'm talking about our degree and also some of the concepts of critical thinking and higher order thinking and some of the concepts from Bloom's taxonomy, which I think will also show up in concert with your ideas. So professional education, this is the definition that you find around, and it's also really kind of a touchstone for health professions education. Professional education is this idea that you're going to educate students in a specific area and then prepare them to go directly into the professional world. And it's informed by those working professionals out in that world where you train the students and where people are going to have the jobs that are similar in the future that they're some of their preceptors or field placement coordinators might have had. So professional education is like, you think of it in terms of medical education, nursing education, engineering. These are common fields that are typified by when folks think about a professional education approach. Our last, our general perspective is that we are preparing people for the practice workplace, and we're very much interested in what can you do. Like once you graduate, what can you do? Not what do you know necessarily, but what can you actually get accomplished. And you'll see in a few minutes, we take a very concrete approach to that, a down-to-earth approach, as it were, and I'll share some of that in a few minutes. This is informed by data on satisfaction and competence. We have learned over the years that our grads really like their field placements. They learn a lot there, and they get a lot of jobs from where they do their field. So that's been very important for us. And obviously, we want the program to be relevant, so we focus it or anchor it really on the public health practice needs. And this last, second last point is of vital importance. In our region, it's a smaller rural region, and we have an accessible regional university here. In a way, the market forces inform the size and the scope of our program. It's a bit of we don't want to flood our market with too many grads, and consequently we constrain the size of the program to make it both manageable as well as so as not to overwhelm the market. And I've already spoken about the employer and alumni input. The last revision that we did, it took us a little bit further down this continuum, and it was really focused on a lot of things that we learned over the years. More about like what folks wanted to learn in the community, but also what stakeholders in the community believed were important in those potential future employees. But also we had to be mindful of the critical component elements, job training type of activities that people are going to need. For example, you need to know something about sanitation. You need to know about things like budget and finance, health threats. Some of that core content is in some ways prescribed by CEF, but in other ways, we have to also elaborate on that in this context. We also had a lot of input from the field about advocacy, community integration, critical thinking, creativity, things of that nature that are more cross-cutting. And specifically, we wanted our students who were engaged in this curriculum to have an opportunity to lead and to really think about, you know, what it means to take on a leadership role and to organize people into teams and then get something accomplished. So we have some of the experiential features are frequent public speaking, connection to the health departments, actually working on prevention programs out in the community, doing risk assessments, things of that nature. And I've already mentioned that some of the design elements include cohorts, and you know, having people go through as a cohort, really learn from each other. Full-time students typically have an admissions policy to keep the program constrained in terms of size. Sequenced coursework, very little redundancy, and that was something that we really focused on. You know, when things are redundant, they're intentionally redundant, so it's a further understanding, and you know, trying to make this very interactive. So those are some features of our program. Just you know, just so everybody in the community kind of knows what we're talking about when we are talking about our perspective and the type of program that we have. So we've already covered some of this from leadership, teamwork, creative problem solving, critical thinking. These are some of the more hands-on sort of skills that we try to train in the environment. And this idea is also that skills are transferable between jobs in public health, which is very similar to a concept that you put forward, Mark. And you know, I think it's just absolutely necessary. Now, one of the ways in which we do this is very concrete, or I would say even down to earth kind of approach, is through a course called The Essentials, which is an acronym for the essential skills, strategies, and expertise necessary to improve and advance low resource settings. And that acronym is really kind of apt. What we learned was that some of our students who were doing field placements were actually going abroad, and they were when they were going abroad, they were doing things that we hadn't taught them in class. This is the gentleman on the left there in the yellow shirt. His name is Silas. Silas did his field in Rwanda, and what the agency there wanted him to do was help build biosand water filters. And so he did his whole entire field placement there doing biosand water filters, creating these water filtration systems that we hadn't taught him to do or even really understand. And so, you know, Silas is a handy guy, and he figured it out, and he created a lot of biosand water filters. In fact, you saw one there. But this is how you do a biosand water filter, and so we created an environment where people could actually learn how to do this. This is an off-site location. Everybody goes through here. It's a cohorted program, so everybody goes off to this campus called the Baccalaureate campus, where they actually learn how to do things with their hands with respect to the this program. In fact, there's a student there, I think, that may be in the audience. She's now a faculty member and runs an undergraduate program, Dr. Williams. I think that's a picture of you on the left. So it was nice to see your name in the attendee list. The Essentials actually really is a rewarding class. People really like it. But what it is it's an example of how, you know, sort of our orientation, which is what can you do? You know, what can you actually get done? This is just an example of one of the things, one little buildings that we've put up in a little village that we have of some exemplar environments that you might run into in a field in maybe the developing world. And this is wattle and daub being used on the right to create a wall, and there's some homemade bricks that we made at the side on the left, and we framed that out of local source timber and so on. So you can kind of see, you know, it's a little bit of an extreme example, but it's emblematic of how we think about the program. That's the crew right there. And the gentleman on the right, by the way, this gentleman on the right is Dr. Mike Stutes. He's a director of our undergrad programs, and was just fantastic advocate for this degree. So, so some key questions that got our philosophy. I guess this first one is the number one question, and this kind of really cements sort of how we think about it. If undergrad trained engineers can build bridges and buildings, in fact, I drove across a couple of bridges on the way to work today. I'm really glad that they know exactly how to do stuff, because the bridges didn't fall in, and you know, we're all probably sitting in buildings, and we're not more than a couple of inches away from something that was designed well by an engineer. So why wouldn't undergraduate then public health professionals have a comparable level of expertise and skill? And then, you know, I guess the question that follows is, on day one, can you pitch in and help protect the public's health with, you know, your skills? So that's our approach. But what's interesting to me is the extent to which it builds on things like, you know, critical thinking, problem solving, orientation, you know, accessing the information that has come before, you know, knowing how to find that type of information. Those are ways in which the you know, the two approaches are pretty similar. You know, I've talked about the fact that our degree program is really goes back about 60 years, and this is key, I guess, because our university exists really for stewardship of place. We're a regional, accessible institution. We have, you know, we're in Central Appalachia. We're focused on making things better around here, as well as nationally, but focusing on the region. We have about 40% Pell Grant eligibility. 85% of our undergrads come from 15 counties, 15 contiguous counties in Tennessee, and 9 border counties in North Carolina and Virginia. And so that's a very, you know, local undergrad population. At the grad level, however, our programs are national and international. People come here from all around the world. So I guess the last thing about our regional nature of our students is about half of our students, rather, are first-generation college students. So you know, sometimes that can inform the type of thinking that maybe, and type of pressure sometimes that families place on students who are going away to college for the first time. And I think that you referenced that earlier, Mark, as well as Sarah. You may have referenced it as well. So anyway, that's our general education, our general approach to our professional education orientation here, and I look forward to this conversation.
So we thought we'd come back to this reflection and the kind of thinking about your own programs and this kind of dichotomous presentation of liberal education and professional education. One thing that the three of us had the pleasure of doing in preparation for giving this as the plenary talk in March, or the intention of giving it as the plenary talk in March, is we actually spoke, I think, almost weekly for somewhere between 4 to 6 months. And it was a really fascinating, I think I can speak for all of us, I'll let the others comment, but a fascinating progression for each of us. My program, I definitely developed at the University of Washington following a liberal education framework. I came at it thinking, we're liberal education, that's what we're doing, that, you know, I followed all those guidelines. And then we started engaging in this conversation and reading about the different perspectives. And what we came to realize, let me see if I've taken back over. Sorry, that there's pros and cons to both approaches to education. And really, we came to this thinking and this diagram that we have this perception that professional education really emphasizes field sites, workforce-oriented approaches, technical training, hands-on, what you can do the day you arrive on the job after you leave. Liberal education really emphasizes these transferable skills, cultural sensitivity and leadership, critical and practical thinking, quantitative literacy, teamwork, and problem solving. And that there's some overlap in our perceptions, but that these have these distinct orientations, and that overlap is very small. So we came to this with these perceptions. And after 6 months of weekly conversation, what we realized is that the reality is really an integration of this. And I'll reflect on why I start by saying this isn't just a philosophical discussion. This is relevant. This has hands-on implications for our own curriculum, for working with our advising staff, our teaching assistants, our faculty, our community. Because what I did after these conversations was I really actually revisited our curriculum, looking with more of an eye of how do I make sure that I'm meeting the needs of all my students. We have a large program. We've grown rapidly to having 250 graduates a year. We all programs have to follow the CEF accreditation. We have these new requirements from 2016, the new competencies. We all have to do that, but how we emphasize it or how we prioritize, kind of the cutting block that Mark talked about, is how each of our programs become unique. But within my 250 graduating class each year, I have a small cohort who plan to go directly into more traditional public health work at our county health department or with our Department of Health, with agencies that are really very kind of traditional public health. And what I now do is I do a lot more assessment early on with the students, a lot more intentional conversation with the students about how to make the most of the curriculum. They all have required core courses, which I would say use public health content in a very liberal education way to teach those kind of cross-cutting skills. But if they envision that they are stopping with a bachelor's degree and they want to go into what we might describe as more traditional public health work placement, I tell them you have to have an internship. You've got to go work at King County Public Health. Let us help you set up an internship so you can get that more deep dive, that field site training, develop that in-depth skill set. Whereas for the students who know they're going on to law school, they don't need that. They need more of the broad kind of cross-cutting, more liberal education approach that they're then going to take on to law school and take as content and transferable skills to apply to policy development down the road. So it has taught me as a program director that these aren't separate worlds. They really overlap, and the reality is so much more overlapping and in the middle, and that like good public health practitioners, we actually really have to understand the community, which when running a program is the community of our students and the community where they're going to go and work in the future. And that might be a very broad workforce, or it might be a more focused workforce if you're developing a program and you know that your students stay local, then you have to identify what those jobs are and work. With our workforce, with our students, they go to all different pathways around the world, but there are subsets within. And now I more intentionally have built in to my faculty development, to my staff advising training, to my own approach within courses to be much more intentional about how students make the most of their time with the curriculum. I don't know if Mark or Rob, if either of you want to comment. And if there's questions, the intent of this was originally a plenary that was going to be a very interactive workshop. So it always feels a bit strange then switching it to a webinar where I don't know if you've all gone to sleep out there or if you're still engaged. So please feel free to type in comments or questions, and then Rob or Mark, maybe you can make some comments.
I'd like to speak to the diagram for a moment, if I could. Whoops, let's go back to it. So when we think about this overlap, I really agree with this, that there's a lot of overlap. But what I don't want to miss is this idea that there's still room for distinctions. I think that one of the conclusions that we came to in this relationship, and I really have enjoyed it, is this idea that people will make a choice sometimes about where they go to school based on this type of orientation, and consequently, it's okay to put the program out there as a program that's more liberal education approach, more professional education approach. And make that distinction. I think, because there is so much overlap, it truly is probably an artificial dichotomy. One of my favorite quotes is that the world is full of two kinds of people, those who can make artificial dichotomies and those who can't. And, the reality is that things aren't, sometimes they're much more in the middle. So I just wanted to I guess, bring that perspective that, you can make the case that there are some uniquenesses to the programs, and you can market even your program in that way. And it's fine to do that, but to do so without necessarily diminishing the quality or potential impact of the other, I think is important.
Mark, if you want to comment, and I don't know if you saw, there's a question about job placement, and I'll respond to it after you because I also have the liberal education program approach.
Sorry, the problem with technology is that I just noticed that my mic was still muted. So let me start that again. Now that you've all watched me talk to myself for a minute. So Chris, let me answer your question. And I don't know if attendees can see the question, but the question is, do you find your students have difficulty locating jobs immediately upon graduation without clear job training approaches? So let me say a little bit to that, and then I'll pass it to Sarah, who can say more. With respect to the public health major here at UB, I can't answer that question yet. We are part of that upward trajectory, and we'll graduate our first students, not this spring, but the following spring. So I look forward to being able to answer that question. What I can say that informs this and informs what you need to do in career counseling from a liberal education perspective is informed by my previous life as a psychology professor. So prior to becoming a public health person, I was a faculty member of the psychology department and ran our undergraduate advising there for a while. Psychology is a very similar discipline to public health. Lots of folks are interested in it. It's a very popular major. There are a range of career options that are available. And similar to a lot of things with the undergraduate versus graduate distinction in public health, a lot of the jobs that are clearly labeled psychology require additional training. That said, people who come out with undergraduate degrees in psychology do quite well in employment settings. The majority of them actually end up in some kind of business-related setting. And the way that they do that is that they talk about the transferable skills. So in what ways does being able to analyze human behavior, to understand how people work, to understand how groups function and things like that, apply in a business context? And so what we do with our did with our students when I was in psychology was to help them think about those kinds of skills. What have you learned and what are the skill sets in this program? And how would you talk about it in this kind of employment context? And that's sort of a hallmark, I think, of the liberal education approach getting applied to a career counseling perspective. Exactly the same thing is true for public health. So being able to analyze a complex system is absolutely fundamental for understanding practically every public health problem, but there are a lot of complex systems out there across a range of career domains that call on that knowledge. And so I think, and Sarah can give you specific data about it, students do quite well in employment coming out of either type of approach. The types of career counseling and preparing students for the job market that you do coming out are a little bit different across the two.
Yeah, and so we do find that there's a range, and I think that the question highlights exactly the point I am trying to emphasize, that the more intentional you are at the beginning with students about the design of your program and what the types of jobs they can expect to obtain, or the career pathways that they can expect to obtain through the degree program, is critical. Because we have a range of students. We have students who engage very closely with the degree program, with advising staff, with faculty, and they are employed usually before they graduate. We have students working that graduated and went to work for Politico as a journalist. We've got students that are in the county health department, at the state health department, Planned Parenthood. We have students that are getting hired in positions that typically have been filled by graduates with MPH degrees. They are students who have been very intentional with how to make the most of their educational experience.
Excellent.
I think whether you're a professional program or a liberal education program, students' engagement with the process and the pathway is critical.
Yeah.
We do have students who kind of struggle to figure out what they want to do when they finish. As an adolescent physician, watching students graduate at age 22, I would say it's actually fairly developmentally appropriate that many of them are still struggling with what their career pathway is going to be. But it's where we try very hard. We can always do better, but we try very hard with advising staff, with our teaching assistants, with our faculty, with the leadership of the degree program, to try to be consistent in our messaging and our communication about what the range of options, the range of pathways are. We absolutely try to get students to do what Mark said, which is think about and present in their resumes the transferable skills that they have learned through the program. So, and I would imagine, I'm seeing Rob nod, and I would imagine even in his degree program, or especially in a professional degree program, students may not have specific field site experience in the job that they're going to apply for. So they're still needing to think about, how do I take the skills I learned building sanitation stations in, was it Kenya, or I forgot what country, and apply that to a different context. And so it is the complexity of working with students is helping them identify what their skills are, and to think about what their competencies are, instead of thinking about one defined job that they're applying to. And I think that holds true with any form of degree training. You know, I work a lot with med students, and even for them, you have to think about what kind of pathway do they want after they're done? What are their skills? What are they most interested in? And a lot of that is that developmental process. And if we as faculty staff are not clear on the curriculum, or not thinking intentionally and making it as transparent as we can be up front and through the process, and connecting with graduates after, so it's always an iterative process and we're changing, building up parts that we weren't strong enough in, then we're not serving our students well. I hope that answers.
Yeah,
Rob,
I would only add that first of all, I agree with your comments, Sarah, and I would add that there's, I guess, a lot of value in doing a field if you're going to go into the, if you're trying to go straight into the workforce, because about a third of our students actually get jobs where they do their field. And that has proven to be of vital importance. But I also want to segue into the next question, which is an interesting question. What implications does this whole sort of conceptualization have on graduate education? And you know, what does that mean? I mean, on its face, one might think, well, liberal education might prep someone better for graduate education because it teaches them how to think. And you know, I would say that only about 10% or so of our grads go into the into grad programs. It's relatively low. A lot of our grads go on to professional school or other places, but about 10% go on to the MPH. And you might guess that there, you know, when you have sort of a first level understanding of epidemiology, for example, those concepts are no longer new when you take an intro to epidemiology class in the MPH. And so there's some complexity with, you know, how to think about, you know, Bloom's taxonomy when you're teaching skills, because once you learn skills, you've learned some skills, and you practice them, and you know, you can get better, but you're not necessarily going to enter an intro to epi class at the master's level, you know, at the second position or third position higher. So I would say there's some complexity there, and I'd like for both of the other panelists here to maybe speak about you know, your perspective with respect to graduate education and this question.
I can add a comment. Just I do think this is a really critical question, and I think it is what many people around the country are struggling with, and certainly ASPPH has led some of these conversations. The exponential growth in undergraduate training will impact our MPH training. It has to. So, and the fact that we have a lot of different programs taking different approaches, and so the graduate programs are really going to need to think about how a student coming from an undergrad education in public health is prepared or not prepared for different parts of their training. You know, historically, we've seen many people applying to MPH programs coming from more clinical realms and bringing a skill set that is historically from the clinical practice. We are seeing, certainly at the UW and I believe nationally, an increase in students that are coming from more social science backgrounds and not having advanced health professional training prior to doing an MPH. And that's requiring MPH programs to think about what knowledge and experience their grad students are bringing to the program, and how do they best utilize the curriculum of an MPH program. We definitely think of the MPH as more of that deep dive, that more specializing in different areas, whether that's health services or epi or biostats. But I think the undergrad education is going to change the landscape, certainly if we keep seeing this exponential expansion in students graduating with public health degrees.
And just one piece that I would add to that, I agree with everything that both Rob and Sarah have said about the implications for the MPH and other public health degrees. One of the things that I think we should consider as we continue to build out our undergrad programs and as we think about graduate education are the combinations of a public health undergraduate training and other kinds of graduate degrees. So at least, you know, here at Buffalo, the traditional degrees you do if you want to go on to med school or biology, sometimes biochemistry, a lot of biomedical sciences, and then occasionally some social sciences. You know, I would argue that in a public health undergraduate and then a health professions graduate degree is a tremendously powerful connection but so is undergraduate public health and law. I mean, how great would it be to have a cadre of lawyers trained who not only knew what they had learned about the law in their graduate training, but had a public health perspective and could do policy work as well as litigation work on health issues from that, or urban planners with a health approach, or so on. So I think we can consider broadly, and one of the strengths I would argue particularly of the liberal education perspective is that there's skills that are transferable to other graduate domains. And I think that should be on the table as we're considering these kinds of broader implications of the degree.
So I think that we are done, Sarah.
Yes, well, I just wanted to, I hate to cut this off because this is such valuable conversation, but I did want to note that, as Sarah mentioned, ASPPH is definitely having these conversations with all of our members about specifically the baccalaureate to master's relationship. And there's a work group of the education committee that is tasked with kind of discussing this and figuring out the implications and giving guidance. So a lot more to come on that. And also an hour is just not enough to talk about all of this. So I am very much looking forward to the session at the Undergraduate Summit that'll be in March. And so thank you to our speakers today. And there will be more to come in March at the Undergraduate Summit. This webinar has been recorded and it will be available along with a PDF of the slides on our website later this week, and all the participants will receive an email when that is up and ready to go and available. There are some other webinars coming up in the ASPPH Presents series, some of these specifically geared toward undergraduate audiences, undergraduate faculty and administrators. And this March 7th, save the date. We'll also be offering an undergraduate faculty development workshop on the day prior on March 6th, so make sure to keep that day on your calendar open as well. Thank you, Rob, Sarah, and Mark. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.